Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be looking at something that people often say to me is a real challenge to them. You can harmonize a given part, like a melody, but what happens when the melody notes repeat? Because sometimes you've put down a chord and then you get the same melody note again, so you put down the same chord. If you get the same melody again, well, you put down the same chord. In other words, it gets you a bit stuck. So it's worth thinking, well, what can I do with repeated notes? Now, there's one thing you can do straight away, which is to think this. If I have a note, it's going to be the root of one chord, it's going to be the third of another chord, and it's going to be the fifth of another chord. And those three chords will all fit in the prevailing key. Let's have a think about this. Say I have the note C in the melody. Well, C is at the bottom of chord 1 if I'm in the key of C major, isn't it? So a C major chord or a chord 1 in C major, C's in it. Okay, C is the middle of an A minor chord, a chord 6. So you see C is the third of this chord 6, this A minor chord, and C is also the fifth of an F major chord or a chord 4. So if you've got repeated C's and you're in C major, you can go from 1 to 6 to 4. And those are just the three diatonic chords that fit that note. Diatonic meaning the chords that are in that key. Chords 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So in C major, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Or C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished. So just by using those diatonic chords, you've got three possibilities. Now that's before you get into the possibility that actually that note might be a seventh in some other chord. So you can think, well, that C is also the seventh of a 2/7 chord or a D minor 7 chord. So you've got all these possibilities before you have to go further afield and think about, can I use some kind of chromatic chord? In other words, a chord that's using notes that don't belong to the key, or start doing some clever stuff like that. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is to look at this repeated line of E flats. So say you had a melody that had all those E flats, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, harmonizing 8 repeated notes is something that's highly unlikely to be facing you. But what I'm going to try and do in this video is to show you how you can do what I've just explained, and if you need to or want to, how you can do something a bit more juicy, a bit more spicy with your harmony to make it go even further. So if you had to do 8 of these things, well, you'd probably want more than 3 different diatonic chords. Okay, let me just play you what I've written so you hear it first, and then we can talk about it. Now, hopefully, if you listen to that, you're very aware that we've got 8 repeated E flats at the top. But also, I'm hoping you're aware that the harmony is always on the move, isn't it? We're always going somewhere new. There's something a bit colourful going on. And we've managed to sustain the repetition of those 8 E flats. Well, let's have a look at how I've done it. It's not the only way of doing it at all. It's just one way of thinking about it. So if we're in the key of E flat major, what have I done? I've started here with the tonic chord, chord 1, E flat major. All I've done now is to use a passing note or a passing tone to take us on to one of those other diatonic possibilities. This is a chord of C minor, which in E flat major is chord 6. So I've gone from 1 to 6. Because the bass has slipped down a third, I can put a passing note or a passing tone in there just to keep the bass line moving. Then I'm going to use another passing note or another passing tone, but this one happens to turn my C minor chord into a C minor 7 in its last inversion, so that's another bit of colour, and it takes me on very nicely to this A flat major chord. So A flat major in the key of E flat major is chord 4. So I've gone E flat, C minor, A flat. 3 diatonic chords in E flat major. 1, 6, 4. And I'm kind of distracting a little bit from those repeated notes at the top by having this mobile bass line. It feels like the bass is kind of going somewhere. We're coming down this scale, which I'm going to try and keep going in the next bar, the next measure for a bit. And that kind of, if you've got this melodic movement in the bass line, it's kind of taking you away from these repeated notes at the top. Okay, so now we've done 3 notes. Well, we've done those 3 diatonic possibilities that we talked about. So what am I going to do next? Well, I'm going to use the E flat major chord again, but I'm going to use it in first inversion. So it's called 1 in first inversion. So that's another thing to think about. You've got these 3 diatonic chords, but you've also got the inversions of those 3 diatonic chords. The first inversions being particularly useful. So I've used that there because we've got root position chords in the first measure, the first bar. So maybe it's time to use a first inversion chord, but it enables me to revisit the first chord, but this time in first inversion. It also enables me to keep that bass line going down the scale if it goes on to that G. Okay, now you'll notice that the 4th E flat has got 2 beats. Now I could just sit on the chord for 2 beats and then go on to the next chord, but that kind of sits down. It sort of emphasizes the fact that we're not only stuck melodically, we're also now stuck rhythmically. Oh, right, okay. So what have I decided to do in this bar? Well, let me explain this. We've got E flat major chord 1 in first inversion, and I'm going to come back to it on the 3rd beat of the same bar, the same measure. Now that may seem like a funny thing to do, because why would you want to use the same chord again? Well, if I had 2 beats on each note in this chord, that would indeed be a sort of musical kiss of death, wouldn't it? Because I'd have this chord, I'd sit there for the 2nd beat, and then I'd do it again. But one thing you can do is this. What I've done here in the alto part is to use what you might say is a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbour tone. Furthermore, it's a chromatic lower auxiliary or chromatic lower neighbour tone, because I'm using A natural, which doesn't belong to this key signature of E flat. And I've done exactly the same thing in the bass. So you see what's happening there? I've started on B flat, I've gone down a note, and I've come back up to the B flat again. I've started on G in the bass, gone down a note, come back up again. But I've done it chromatically. Instead of going to A flat and F natural, I've gone to A natural and F sharp. So it's colourful, and it's kind of adding some real interest and intrigue. So the listener's now really hooked on, oh, I'm hearing this A natural and F sharp, which distracts us from the fact that this E flat is just being held. So we don't get that rhythmic sort of stoppage, as well as this kind of boredom of the repeated melody note, because something colourful is happening underneath. You could also say that while it's true to say that that's a chromatic lower auxiliary, that's a chromatic lower auxiliary, so it's double chromatic lower auxiliaries or double chromatic lower neighbour tones, there's also a sense in which this is giving us a new chord, because based on F sharp, A, C, E flat is a diminished 7th chord, isn't it? Now I haven't actually got a C in the chord, but I've got something of the outline of that. I think it's right in this case to talk about these as chromatic lower neighbour tones or chromatic lower auxiliary notes, but there's also that just that little hint of diminished 7th. So in this 2nd measure, this 2nd bar, we get this. And you hear that's kind of really colourful, isn't it? And you see how it distracts from the rhythmic stoppage at the top and distracts from the repeated notes. The chords are taking us in new directions. And we come back quite happily to this chord at the end of the bar that we used at the beginning, because we've had that intervening chromatic stuff. Okay, now then, what am I up to next? Because you might have noticed there's a D flat in the tenor part. And again, D flat looks like a chromatic note. It's nothing to do with this key signature of E flat major. So you think, well, if I'm going to do something like a passing note or a passing tone, I'd use a D natural. Yeah, that's true. But if I use a D flat, it becomes a bit more colourful, and it's this added spice and colour that's making me get away with these repeated notes at the top. Now, why D flat? Well, if I start with this E flat major chord, E flat major is the tonic chord, it's called 1 in E flat major. If I put D flat into it, it then turns it into a dominant 7th chord in A flat major. Okay, why would I want to do that? Am I trying to modulate to A flat major? I could be trying to modulate to A flat major because the next chord with E flat at the top could be an A flat major chord. So I could use that D flat and then have an A flat major chord. And that's what we call a secondary dominant, because A flat major is chord 1 in A flat major, therefore resolves the 5/7 in A flat major onto chord 1 in A flat major. But A flat major is also chord 4 in E flat major. So that means I've gone 5/7 to 1 in a different key, but chord 1 in this other key is a chord in the prevailing key. That's a secondary dominant. Now, I'm trying to spruce it up even further, because this is a 5/7 in A flat major, but it's also a 5/7 in A flat minor. So what I'm going to do now is in the next bar, the next measure, I'm going to use a chord of A flat minor. So instead of A flat major, I've gone A flat minor. So I've borrowed the tonic chord from the parallel minor, A flat major, A flat minor. So by using that D flat, I'm sort of expecting to hear A flat major next, but I could also hear A flat minor. So that's what I get, A flat minor. Now, that gives me colour. Again, it's distracting from the repetition of the E flats, but I've also got another opportunity to do something to spruce things up, because you've noticed probably in the alto part, I haven't gone straight to A flat there. I've delayed the A flat to there. So what's going on here? Well, this is what we call a suspension. So if you know about suspensions, as I know many people will do, you'll know that this alto part is giving me a 9/8 suspension, because it's going from a 9th above the bass note to an octave above the bass note, 9/8. Suspensions have to be prepared. So this suspended note has to be prepared on the beat before. So these two notes have to be the same. So we prepare, we sound, we resolve. P belongs to its chord, which it does. S is dissonant with this chord, which it is. And then S resolves by step, normally downwards, onto a note that belongs to this chord, which it does. So I started off here, didn't I, saying this could be a secondary dominant in A flat major, put a D flat in, go to an A flat major chord. It could also be a secondary dominant in A flat minor and give me that borrowed chord from the parallel minor. And then I'm going to throw a 9/8 suspension into the mix. Oh, that's rather nice, isn't it? It's like a juicy moment. And you see all these bits of chromatic colour and moments of juicy kind of elaboration are drawing attention away from these repeated E flats. Okay, well, we're almost at the end. We're dealing with the 7th and 8th E flat at the end. And when you're looking at those two E flats, you might well be saying, well, this is going to have to be a 4/1 cadence. 4/1. It could be. You could have a 4/1 cadence, A flat major, E flat major. You could even make it a little bit chromatic by going A flat minor, E flat major. So you're borrowing 4 from the parallel minor and then having your E flat major. Absolutely fine. Now, I've just tried to stretch things a bit further because you know what I'm like. And in this chord, we're going to do something a little bit more colourful. One thing you can do is, as I said earlier, is to think about whether your E flat that you're trying to deal with, that's being repeated incessantly, does it belong to an extension chord? Well, instead of using chord 4, could I use chord 5? Let's have a think. Chord 5 is B flat, D, F, the dominant chord. If I extend it, it goes up to A flat for a 5/7. It goes up to C For a 5/9, it goes up to E flat, ha ha ha, for a 5/11. So how about we have a really kind of spicy final cadence, a perfect cadence where we go 5/11 onto 1. And now I'm just sort of doing this for the fun of it really. But when you look at this, root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th, I'm using a 5/11, but I'm flattening the 9th just to make it even more colourful before going on there. And because I've been using C flat here, using that C flat again isn't too much of a shock. And actually, if I used the C natural there, I would have false relations with the C flat there. So it's great to have the C flat there. Now, you might look at this and think, oh, that's all very well, but it would never occur to me to extend chords up to 9ths and 11ths and then start chromatically altering notes. Fine, you don't have to do all of these things. But it could certainly occur to you to use the 3 diatonic chords that fit with that E flat. And then you might think about passing notes. You might think about borrowing a chord from the parallel key. You might think about a little bit of chromatic stuff. And then if you're feeling really brave, you might do something like this or something like this. But the end result is this, as we put it all together. Hopefully you agree that sounds quite colourful, and even though we're now really aware of those 8 repeated E flats, the music doesn't sound stuck in any way, does it? Because we've done other things to keep the interest in it. As I say, it's highly unlikely you're ever going to be in a situation where you've got 8 of the same note back to back and you've got to think about, oh my goodness, how am I going to harmonise those 8 notes in 8 different ways? But you might come across 2 notes or 3 notes where you've got to do some of this thinking. So I hope that video has been useful to think about how we deal with this particular challenge. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, I'm just going to invite you to go to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. Click on Maestros, find out something about our international musical community, which is absolutely wonderful. So many perks, benefits being in there, including live streams, discounts off the courses, opportunities to meet other musicians across the world. And I hope you'll take that opportunity if it's useful to you. So www.mmcourses.co.uk to find out more about Maestros.